So my name is Robin Mukherjee. I'm a student at the School of Philosophy and Economic Science. I'm also a writer and teacher of writing in university level. And that is pertinent to what I'm about to say. Earlier this year, in late March, just the beginning of spring, I had the pleasure of attending a literary event at the legendary Five Leaves bookshop in Nottingham. It was a reading and Q&A with a marvellous writer who'd recently published a really wonderful book, a memoir. So it was a joyful occasion. Why was I feeling a little bit edgy? I think it was just being strange. It was just strange being back in Nottingham, where I'd been to university years ago, not entirely, if I can put it like this, successfully. I'd been in a perfectly good course, pursuing a perfectly decent career, but it was neither a course nor a career of my choosing. So I was mulling on this, waiting for the proceedings to proceed, when I noticed that I was sitting at the edge of the gathering by a little round table with a collection of books on it and a sign saying "small but profound," which caught my eye. So I picked up a book at random, and it was this. Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. It's a collection of letters to a young man who had been sent to a military academy when his heart belonged in literature. It's a very nice edition, by the way. I'd read bits of it before in other editions and some of Rilke's poetry, but it seemed oddly apposite in that moment, reminding me of my younger self, who had been, I suppose, what you could call a poet of sorts, embarking all those years ago on a journey in life that didn't quite sit right with, if I can get really grandiose here, the innermost stirrings of his soul. So the subject of this talk is Rainer Maria Rilke. I'll tell you a little about this book and a little about Rilke himself, and then we can just explore a few short passages and some of his ideas. The book wasn't published by Rilke, but by the recipient of his letters, the young man, Franz Kappus, after Rilke's death. As told in the prologue, the young Kappus, a cadet in a military academy, as we said, was reading a volume of poems by a new, much-lauded poet. And as he was doing this, the college chaplain happened along, took a look at the book, leafed through it, stared for a while into the distance and said, "So, our pupil Rainer has become a poet." The fact is that Rilke had also been sent by his parents to that same military academy some years previously. He hadn't exactly flourished and eventually left to complete his studies in Prague, the city of his birth. One can only imagine how disappointed his father must have been at the time. Kappus writes in his preface, "Not yet 20 years old and going into a profession which I felt was directly opposed to my true inclinations, I thought that if anyone was going to understand my situation, it would be the author of a book called To Celebrate Myself." He wrote to Rilke, sent some poetry, and thus began a correspondence, Rilke's contribution to which constitutes this book. Before we consider some passages, I'll tell you something of Rilke's life, which was quite simple in a way. At least the outer trappings were simple. He was born in 1875 to a reasonably comfortable family. We've heard of his father's attempts to turn him into a soldier and how that ended, not well. He had early success as a poet, so that became his professional life. Not that he ever made much money at it. In one of his letters, he says he wished he could send Kappus a copy of his poetry, but sadly couldn't afford to buy one. A poet who can't afford to buy his own books. 'Twas ever thus. He married, traveled, he met Tolstoy, he worked for the artist Rodin for a while, he lived in Paris, and badly mistimed a visit to Germany when the First World War broke out and he was conscripted into the army. So it came back to bite him in the end. Predictably, his aptitude for military pursuits had not increased with age. He barely made it through basic training and ended up in a clerical position. He continued to write after the war, publishing widely and to great acclaim. He died of leukemia at the tragically young age of 51. Much of his skill, of course, is in the language, which is complex, textured, playful, and intense. For those of us who rely on translations, there is nevertheless the depth of his observation and an insight led, for want of a better word, by a kind of mysticism, a yearning, along with a concern for the immediate perplexities, the joys and pains of human existence, the restlessness of our sense that there's more to life, maybe, than what appears to be the ordinary. So let's explore some of his writings. I will just say that a characteristic of his work is that it has the capacity to yield something new every time you read it. There is no one reading of his poems. I simply wouldn't dare. So let's have a look. Unsurprisingly, his letters provide some practical advice to the young poet on the art of poetry. For instance, this one, and there are many examples. If your everyday life seems to lack material, do not blame it. Blame yourself. Tell yourself that you are not poet enough to summon up its riches. For there is no lack for him who creates, and no poor trivial place. Seems to be a recurring theme among the poets, the great poets, that it's not what you see, but how you see it. To prove the point, here's Rilke on a trip to Rome. At first, he complains that the whole place is just a museum. It's nothing but the past. But he begins to settle in and finally grows to love it. He says in one of his letters, infinitely lively waters go over the old aqueducts into the city, and on the many squares dance over bowls of white stone and fill broad capacious basins and murmur all day and raise their murmur into the night, which is vast and starry and soft with winds. He puts you in that picture. It's so evocative. And that is just in a letter. There's also advice on life. When Kappus is going through a difficult time and expresses sadness, much of that related to where he is. He's a lieutenant now. He's in a fort. He feels very alone. What's happening to his writing? Rilke has this to say, and I have abridged it a little. You have had many sadnesses, large ones, which passed. And you say that even this passing was difficult and upsetting for you. But please ask yourself whether these large sadnesses haven't rather gone right through you. Perhaps many things inside you have been transformed. Perhaps somewhere deep inside your being, you have undergone important changes while you were unhappy. If only it were possible for us to see farther than our knowledge reaches, and even a little beyond the outworks of our intuitions, perhaps we would bear our sadnesses with greater trust than we have in our joys. It seems to me that all our sadnesses are moments of tension, because everything we trust and are used to is for a moment taken away from us, because we stand in the midst of a transition where we cannot remain standing. That is why the sadness passes. The new presence inside us, the presence that has been added, has entered our heart, has gone into its innermost chamber, and is no longer even there, is already in our bloodstream. And we don't know what it was. We could easily be made to believe that nothing happened, and yet we have changed as a house that a guest has entered changes. I must admit, sitting in that bookshop in Nottingham, I wished someone had written me a letter all those years ago, a bit like that. But that's not the point. The point is that he's writing to us now. In the first of his letters to the young poet, he says emphatically, examine the reason that bids you to write. Check whether it reaches its roots into the deepest region of your heart. This above all. Ask yourself in your night's quietest hour, must I write? Dig down into yourself for a deep answer. And if it should be affirmative, if it is given to you to respond to this serious question with a loud and simple I must, then construct your life according to this necessity. Your life right into its most inconsequential and slightest hour must become a sign and a witness of this urge. This was framed as advice to a young poet, but I don't think it applies just to writing or to the arts in general. There is the love of something, I think, in each of us deep down within the being. And if we don't follow it, if we don't listen to it, then perhaps we'll miss something that could be important to the way our lives unfold. So the choice isn't what we may or may not have done in the past, which can't, after all, be changed. It's what we choose to do now that shapes what happens next. If you do pick up some Rilke to read, and obviously, I would commend him to you, bear in mind that reading poetry, according to Rilke, needn't be a mere diversion, a momentary entertainment, and then you turn back to the world. If you immerse yourself in the verse of his poems of great poetry, if something of you becomes the poem, which happens quite naturally on a close reading, then there's a moment putting it down when you are, in a way, both in the poetry and in the world you thought you knew. And the question then is, what is that world for you now? What can you see that you hadn't seen before? What deeper reaches have been opened up to you? Great poetry does that. Rilke's poetry, I would say, and I'm not alone in saying it, does exactly that. So I'll leave it there. Have an excellent weekend. Thank you for your company. Philosophy Live is every week, as I'm sure many of you know, Fridays at 8:30 in the morning. Have a lovely day, and goodbye.